So Colossians 2 is where I want to kind of start, and I'm going to just breeze through it real quick. Like literally, I'm going to be maybe 10 minutes. The Lord said there's a tremendous revelation setting in Colossians, and I've started to dig into it. Of course, I haven't had enough time to dig very far. But in 2:9, he says, "Beware any man spoil you through vain deceit, after traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, not after Christ." And there's basically 4 times in the book of Colossians in chapter 2 that he said, be careful about men. Colossians 2:4, Colossians 2:8, Colossians 2:16. And in 2:4 he says that least any man should beguile you. The word beguile means to feel wrong or to bring false reasoning into your life. And in 2:8 he says that men would spoil you. And the word spoil means to lead from truth and hold you captive. Mm-hmm. And in 2:8 again he talks about deceiving, to be deceived, which actually talks about having flattery. Yes. And in 2:16 he talks about that men would judge you, which means that they would bring you under their opinion, and that you would value their opinion over the opinion of God. But 2:10 is kind of like the answer to the whole thing. He says that you are complete in Him, which is the head of all principality and power. When I first got born again in 1979, that verse right there was the main verse for my first year of my life. I meditated on that verse until that became such a reality inside of me that I understood that in Christ I lack nothing. In any other way, I lack everything. And that I am complete in Him, and that if He's done a work in me, He's done a work in me. He hasn't done a half-hearted work or a half-effort work or brought it to a certain place and abandoned the work. He completed the work. The work stands finished. Yes. Even though it's not finished in how I see it, it's finished in how He sees it. Yes. That it is finished. And that where we're sitting right now, I want to make sure I talk about one more thing in Colossians in 2:8. He talks about that he says that we would be spoiled. Beware lest any man would spoil you. And then he talks about 10, you're complete. And he talks about being spoiled, and the word spoil means to be carried off into some sort of a philosophy of men's wisdom. And I think that the church, for the most part, is spoiled right now. Yes. We are spoiled little brats. We're spoiled kids. We're spoiled thinking we got to have our stuff. We're spoiled. I mean, it's pathetic. Mercy. And he says that don't be spoiled through philosophy and deceit. And here's what he says, after traditions of men. And the word traditions of men actually means the act of giving up. And we're wondering what's going on at the church and leaders. And I was on the phone this week with a leader who is ready to quit. And you'd be shocked. And when you talk about the traditions of men, here's the real root of the definition. It means a willingness to surrender your city. And that is what's happening in America. We are surrendering our cities. Leaders are surrendering their cities because they're allowing men to spoil them and beguile them and to deceive them and to judge them. And they're allowing those things to have a greater influence than God saying, you know what, you're complete and you lack nothing. You can go do the work that's sitting there. You don't have to surrender your city. And cities are held in the balance right now. See, I'm turning my notes and all. I'll get down to the last point. Then I'm done. In 3:1 it says, if you've been risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sits on the right hand of God. Set your affections on things above, not on things on the earth. You realize that everything that men are trying to tell us and convince us of is something coming from the earth. You know, I don't even remember when it was, but I think it was last week I said something about that the only prayer that's going to be effective is the prayer that comes from heaven to the earth, not the prayer that comes from the earth to heaven.
Amen.
And that, you know, we've got to have this eternal perspective, not a temporal perspective. We have such a temporal perspective on everything that we want an instantaneous result, which is a temporal perspective. An eternal perspective is, what are we doing? Like the vision of the potatoes in the ground. That's an eternal perspective because we're planting for the future. We're not planting for the moment. Even when we give offerings and, you know, everybody go through this whole motion, you know, give something and God will bless you and blah, blah, blah. And we're wanting like, I'm going to give something in the offering and God's got to produce $1,000 check in my pocket this week. You know, we don't even see that offering has nothing to do with money. It's about what it's going to present and do for the kingdom. And it's like I tell people, ministry costs you nothing. The act of getting there does. The act of ministry costs us nothing. It is nothing to pray for somebody. It is nothing to prophesy to somebody. That costs you really nothing. I mean, it may cost you some suffering and some things along the way, but the act of actually doing the ministry. Now, let's just get to the heart of this. I just got to start rambling. If you're dead and your life is hid with Christ in God, for you are dead. It's a statement of fact. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall you also appear with him in glory. Well, that's a pretty good promise, isn't it? Verse 2 is really the key to the whole chapter in eternal perspective. So here's what I want to get to. I'm going to get right to the heart of this. And then I'll say something and then we'll... In this chapter, in 3 places, he also says put on. And he says it in verse 10. And have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. Verse 12. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, and long-suffering. And the last one's in 14. And above all of these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. Now I want to say what the revelation is the Lord gave me. He said this, put on the eternal man. Verse 10. Put on the eternal character. Verse 12. And put on the foundation, the eternal foundation. Verse 14, love. The word put on means to sink into a garment. And this is what the Lord started to speak to me, and this is what he spoke to me in worship again this morning, is that when we put on those things, we are being mantled with what is eternal and not what is temporal. And what God is doing in this hour, he said eternal mantles, this is what he spoke to me in there, eternal mantles are coming forth for us to be mantled with eternal things.
Amen.
And many people are chasing temporal mantles that men are carrying, that men have formed. And we're seeking things after men, and we're not seeking to be mantled with that which is eternal. And then he started speaking to me about Keith Green's mantle, and he said the reason Keith Green's life was effective is he allowed me to mantle him with these 3 things. And the reason his life was effective was because he was mantled with what was eternal, not with what was temporal. And many of the structures that we see, and many of the things that we see as success, are temporal mantles. They're not eternal mantles.
That's right.
They're not going to make it. So we sat here today, and the question, I guess, is, are we seeking the eternal mantles, or are we seeking the temporal mantles? And the Lord started speaking to me again, and then he said, he asked me some things, and I was dialoguing, and then it was like, this is what he said, he says, there's men that have chased down to try to gain someone's mantle by laying on a grave or doing something, you know. He says, that's not how you get an eternal mantle. You allow me to bring it so you're sunk into it. You have to allow yourself to be positioned into it. Chasing those things will not get it. It's going to come by you allowing me to mantle you with something that's eternal, not something that's temporal. Because many times, I mean, I've been to, been in Charles Finney's pulpit and stood there and blah, 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 but just because I stood there doesn't mean that I got that mantle.
Yes.
I was at a place where the mantle existed at one place. Literally what it was as if I stepped into a place where the eternal mantle was presented. And because I was sitting in that place, you could sense that there was something there because the eternal was still present in that place because he carried it to that place. It's like when we went to Finney's grave, you walk into the grave and it's like this 30-foot bubble that you just walk into, and the peace of God and the birds are singing and you can't even hear the cars driving by or nothing. You literally walk in a bubble. And it's like the eternal was deposited there, you see. And so here we sat today, we're actually ones that are carrying eternal mantles and eternal things inside of us. How much more would God not want us to just let our life sink into it, where he says your life is dead and it's hid in Christ. How is our life hid in Christ? It's not hid because you got rid of your sin. It's hid because you allowed him to mantle you with what's eternal. Now when they see you, they see righteousness shining forth as a light, like Isaiah says, and they see salvation as a lamp that's burning inside of our heart. And now what happens, you see, is salvation gets the expression through righteousness. Righteousness becomes the mantling of something that is eternal. So when we sink into salvation, into the very depths of salvation, and it becomes these things that we put on, the man, the character, and the foundation that's listed there, that's the outcome of salvation that's been birthed in us, and the light that we're carrying inside of us is those things that he's talking about there. Now what happens is that has a place where this mantle and this wrapping of that which is eternal, which is righteousness in our life, our righteousness begins to glow upon the earth. Because I'm going to tell you something, men do not see salvation in your life. Salvation is a work that happened in your heart. What they see is righteousness that has been illuminated because of the salvation in your heart. Now they see something that is an eternal mantle, and it isn't something that we're setting here. You see, our whole defining, we're going to have to redefine everything on how we look at some stuff, because it's really messed up.